Hey, everybody. Welcome to the best in true crime podcasting. This is True Crime Tuesday, and we've got a great interview lined up for you today. Now, I want to make a mention. You'll get the entire interview. The only segment of today's show you won't hear is our Dumb Crimes, Stupid Criminals. Why? Because that's under Stitcher Premium. We want to make sure that everybody gets a chance to hear these remarkable interviews of these incredible true crime stories. But for only $5 a month, you can subscribe to Stitcher Premium. That'll give you the entire episode. That includes the entire interview you're about to hear, plus Dumb Crimes, Stupid Criminals, and every episode of Darkness Radio, the best in paranormal podcasting. All 1,000+ episodes commercial free. And if that's still not enough reason for you to want to subscribe, you don't just get True Crime Tuesday and Darkness Radio, which, let's face it, for $5 a month, that's pretty valuable. You get every other show underneath the Stitcher umbrella. That means hundreds of thousands of hours of your favorite type of podcast programming commercial free. Nobody got time for commercials. So if you're interested, then make sure you go subscribe now to Stitcher Premium. Use code word Darkness Radio, all one word, Darkness Radio, for some deep discounts for an entire year's savings. Go do that right now. Take advantage of the special and be able to listen to Darkness Radio, True Crime Tuesday, and all of the other amazing programs across Stitcher's platform. Go subscribe right now. Sit back, relax, and enjoy this episode of True Crime Tuesday. Hello and welcome. You're tuned in to the best in true crime talk radio. This is True Crime Tuesday. I'm your host, Dave Schrader. Along with me, as always, Tim Dennis. Hello, Tim.
Hi there.
Dumb Crime, Stupid Criminals coming up a little bit later, buddy. I hope you've got some wah-wah music and applause, because we've got reason for both today.
Wah-wah is in funny or wah-wah is in sexy?
You know, the wah-wah kind of music that we need for the morons we're going to face. But we do have a great hero story this week. We'll definitely need some applause, so make sure you've got that all queued up and ready to go. Diane Marger Moore is back with us. She became a prosecutor late in her career. As the chief arson prosecutor, she won several murder prosecutions in Marion County, Indiana, that were deemed unwinnable. Before becoming a prosecutor, Diane was a criminal defense attorney and federal public defender. She's here with us now to talk about her new book, 16 Minutes. And we do have a link for the book in today's program guide. Diane, welcome back to the program. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for having me.
Always,
I appreciate it.
It's always fascinating to talk to somebody who's vested into the stories, and it's not just a quick little research project. Not that we have any problems with those authors, but when people have been in the field and, you know, they seem to bring a different perspective to these type of stories and cases. And this one is a delicate story, to say the least. So let's begin. I guess it's March of 1993 for this story, and kind of set the stage for us, would you? Maybe even in the week or so leading up to this, and introduce us to the players.
Sure. So there's a house fire at a small house in a very family neighborhood in Indianapolis. The homes were small. The folks were all working people who lived there. And this house had been purchased recently by a fairly young couple who had a baby. What we know that happened is a fire was started in that home, and it burned the nursery. So arson cases are very, very, very different than other kind of cases, because it's not just a who did it, but also what did they do? And was it an accident, or was it something else? And so fire investigators and law enforcement became involved primarily because the fire only lasted from beginning to end 16 minutes, and because of the extent of burning in the room. So,
all right, so help us with that. Now, understanding arson and what that means, when a fire only burns for 16 minutes from the outside, does that mean that it's concentrated effort? That means an accelerant was probably used, and the rest may not have been treated, so it didn't burn as quickly or as powerfully as the spots where the accelerant was put forth?
It can mean a lot of things. A fire can burn itself out very quickly, depending on the amount of fuel in the room, and fuel is wood or anything that will burn. It could be that the fire was electrical and that it burned out the wiring or the system where it was and it burned itself out. It could be that the fire department got there very, very early, and for that reason, they put the fire out. So there are a number of reasons, but the issue in this case was not how long the fire lasted, but when the firefighters, the initial firefighters, who were two very experienced firefighters, went into this tiny little room, and it was, maybe 4 by 7, a very small room, they found that there was nothing left. Meaning that everything in the room was essentially burned down to about 2 inches from the floor. And that's where the concern was.
2 inches down from the floor. All right. Now, are these the signs that firefighters are usually looking at, or is this arson specialists that come in to investigate, or is it sometimes kind of this cohesive bond between both that will, tell the arson investigators things that they notice that seem out of whack?
It's the latter. So what happened in this case, because there was a death, and by the way, the first-in firefighters put out the fire, what was left of it, in two sprays, so 2 seconds, and they thought that was the end of it because everything was burnt. And then they were told that there had been a child in that room, and they had to try and look for that child among the ashes, essentially. So those firefighters who were very experienced had concerns because they knew when they were called to the fire, and they knew how long it was. They got there quite quickly, and so that was the concern. Whenever there's a death, the fire investigation unit goes to the scene, and when that firefighter, and the fire investigation unit was composed of 1 police officer and 1 fire investigator. The particular fire investigator had been a firefighter for about 20 years beforehand. So when he looked at the room, he too knew there were serious problems. And so he started to investigate it, which is what happens in any case where there's a fire death.
Gotcha. All right. So now talk to me about this family. They had been living there for how long?
Only a matter of weeks.
All right. And talk to me about the mother, the father, and this child involved in the case.
Well, at the time, of course, of the fire, the real issue was where were the parents? Because they were not in the home. The father, when the fire trucks arrived, was wearing the jacket that a firefighter would wear and the hat that a firefighter would wear. And he was sitting at the front door of the house. The mother, no one saw for a period of time, and it turns out that she was at a neighbor's house where she had run earlier, and both of them had made calls to 911 from neighbors' homes and not from the interior of the house.
Okay. Now, was this a close family? I mean, what do we know about their past and their lives together?
Well, that's how it evolves, because in an arson case, one has to rule out all accidental causes. And then, because in this case, a homicide investigator came to the scene and felt certain that there was something wrong here. That detective is the one who started looking into the family while the fire investigators were trying to figure out whether this was an accidental or set fire. So there were really 2 tracks going. And in this case, the third track was an insurance company, a homeowner's insurance company, and they were going to have to pay whether it was arson or not arson because the mortgage company or bank, whichever it was, held the note and they were going to be paid one way or the other. But the insurance company, they really wanted to look at it too because they thought it was arson. So there were really 3 investigations going on at the same time.
All right. You've got, man, there's so much going on just in the quick flash of this. Once the investigation starts, how easy is it? And, from being there, in person doing these type of things yourself, how easy is it to determine on a first pass that this is definitely arson? And are there times that it can look like arson and turn out to be natural, like a spark in a wire or something that just, would have happened without it being set? What kind of understanding can you give us regarding that?
Sure. It's a fascinating field, and some fires are very easy to determine. And most of those are when a coffee pot sets a fire, because they are fire hazards, electric coffee pots. Frequently, curling irons start fires. And what happens is the metal of the curling iron and a small part of the cord is normally left in the outlet. And so you can tell that the fire was started at that location. Fires are normally started either in an outlet or an electric power source if they're electrical type fires. The next thing that firefighters, fire investigators frequently look for is, was there a smoker in the house? Because a lot of fires are caused by either someone leaving a lit cigarette, falling asleep with a lit cigarette, or even sometimes open fireplaces. In this case, in fact, it was so difficult to make a determination about the cause of the fire that after quite a bit of investigation, the fire investigation unit concluded that they didn't know, and so they did not call it. The investigators that were hired by the insurance company were convinced it was arson, but felt that it was arson based on a different cause than the fire investigation unit. And candidly, the detective just believed that these parents or one of them had killed their baby.
Oh, God.
That's what made the case so challenging.
Right. And that has to be a difficult tightrope to walk as well, because obviously you're dealing with somebody, they've just bought a new home, they're starting a new chapter in their life. Suddenly they suffer not only a devastating fire, but a fire that claims their child. And I'm sure this has to be a very cautious dance you have to do in dealing with this so that you're not upsetting parents that may be innocent of what happened, but yet trying to get to the bottom of this.
Extremely difficult. They really understand that, because you're trying to question people who are in a very emotional situation, or at least one of them may be, and their family. Now, understanding the other difficulty in this case was that the case was what was perceived as, with differing opinions about what started the fire, how it was started, and whether or not it was accidental, that the prosecutor who was assigned to the case, and this was before I became a prosecutor, decided not to prosecute it at all. And in fact, the person that was charged with the fire hired a very competent law firm and convinced the prosecution not to move forward. And so the father was let out on bond, which is very unusual, and nothing was going to happen until a new administration came in, and I was appointed the arson prosecutor, And we found out in a very unusual way that the case was about to be dismissed.
Now, I don't understand how this works, Diane, but let's say that it had been dismissed. Can it be reinvigorated after that point, or once the courts have taken a cursory look at it and dismiss it, is it, I know double jeopardy is not the right term, but I mean, is it in that kind of vein where, they'd be very hard pressed to want to re-examine it?
Yes, the court would have an option of refusing to allow it to be refiled. So there's a danger there. It's not double jeopardy because jeopardy doesn't attach with just a charging information or an indictment. In Indiana, a grand jury does not have to look at every case. Instead, the prosecutors in that state can charge serious felonies by what's called an information, just a charging document. So you're absolutely correct. The court would have the power not to allow one to refile the charges. And so there was some serious concern, of course.
How does an attorney that's defending them talk the courts out of prosecuting and moving forward? I mean, obviously the court has the records of what happened. They have expert testimony or so from the investigators and the firefighters. What could be said to throw the prosecution team off the scent?
Well, so in this case, I think what that prosecutor viewed was that his own investigators, the fire investigation unit, had concluded that they could not determine the cause of the fire. And in arson cases, the state has an obligation, especially in an arson murder case, to prove, one, that there were no possible accidental causes for the fire. That's a unique obligation that most prosecutors don't have. If you have a murder and there's a shotgun and you retrieve, the autopsy tells you what caused the death. In arson cases, it's always going to be either carbon dioxide where the victim inhaled it or they're burned. In this case, so the prosecutor looked at it. His own investigators could not determine whether it was accidental or arson. The defendants had not, or the potential defendants had not made any admissions. And so sometimes what investigators will do is look to motive. In this case, there was no big insurance policy on the baby. And because they had not put a lot of money down on the house, they were not going to make a big profit on the house. So there were a lot of reasons. And prosecutors, interestingly, cherish their records, what percentage of their cases they win. I really am opposed to that because sometimes you just have to try the really hard cases that may be hard to win. But you know the person, or you feel certain the person did it, you have to go after them. But all of those, and part of deciding whether you can win the case is the quality of the lawyering on the other side. So if you have a very well-known, high-profile, competent defense lawyer, I think all of those factors played into whether or not the prosecution was going to move forward under the prosecutor who had the case.
Okay, boy, that is a sticky situation, isn't it? When it, hey, we only want to fight the winnable cases. I mean, wouldn't that be great if we could only play the football games we're going to win? If we could only do the things that are gonna work for us in our favor. But when there's justice involved, I mean, is it when there's a death involved in it? Does that make it? I've got to guess that kicks it up another level, where just walking away from it makes it even harder for prosecutors. Or does it make it easier in those cases because it's like, listen, this looks unwinnable. We don't want to put anybody through this. We don't want to look bad putting a family through this. What's kind of the mentality behind that?
Well, I think you have to consider all of those factors. But what happened here was the case occurred during one administration. I mean, prosecutors are elected in the state of Indiana, as they are in most states, and so there's some politics involved. So the administration that was in existence at the time that the house was on fire was not the same administration. They waited until a new administration came in. And so what happens there? If the new administrator, let's say that as the new prosecutor for arson cases, I had decided to dismiss the case or allow it to be dismissed, that would have been held against the new prosecutor. Oh, he's afraid to try the hard cases. The flip side is, if the new prosecutor tried a difficult case that was left over and lost it, the old administration would say they just don't have the ability to do what we could have done. So there is some politics involved in prosecutions.
I got you. All right. When there's a child involved, though, does that kind of cause people to pause a little longer and consider what it would take to prosecute and take this in? I mean, when you think death is involved anyway, it always seems like, hey, we can't just, do a cursory pass. This needs to go a little deeper. Walk me through what the concept is dealing with that when there's a child involved.
Well, I think that we always have to look more carefully when there's a child involved. The other side of that coin, however, is until Susan Smith killed her two beautiful little blonde kids, people are very, very hesitant to believe that a parent would kill their child. And unfortunately, over the last decade, we've seen a lot more of that. But jurors do not want to believe that a parent could kill a child. And so you're already dealing with a harder prosecution than you would be in, say, a bar fight or a man and woman fighting with each other. So
is that, I'm curious, is that changing, though? Because it seems, sadly, we're hearing on a more regular basis, little Jimmy went missing. Oh, Jimmy, just come home. If you've taken Jimmy, send him home. Oh, hoo, hoo, hoo. And then you find out the parents who were up there crying in front of the cameras were responsible for the death all along. It seems to me like, I'm becoming one of those more jaded people. The minute I hear a child's missing, you start thinking, oh, man,
parents.
Which one of these parents? Well, right.
But it changed from the period of Smith through. We've seen Casey Anthony. We've seen a number of cases since. And so I agree with you that I think the perception is changing. But I also think that there are things that we find harder to believe, especially if we're parents. In this case, the detective was a female detective, one of the very, very few in Indianapolis, and one of the only, if not the only, I believe she was the only in the homicide division, who was also a parent and looked at what was left of this infant and said, I'm never going to let this go. Somebody caused this fire and killed this child. And it was really her tenacity, constant tenacity, that really got this case to the point of where it was prosecuted.
Yikes. So heartbreaking. All right. Well, talk to me about the parents. What were their names?
So William Wise was dad.
All right.
At the time of the fire, William Wise was an Indianapolis Fire Department dispatcher. The mother worked in a bank. They had a sort of off and on relationship over a period of a couple of years. And when I say off and on, Dad would go back to northern Indiana, where they were both originally from, and he would date other women. He was just an interesting person. She was unattractive, probably hadn't been with many men. She worked in a bank. She didn't have many friends. That was her. And so they had both come from Elkhart, Indiana. And that's what we knew to begin with. Over the course of investigation, we found out a lot more about the father, that he had actually been trained as a firefighter, that he had done some really serious lying in his lifetime, including on employment applications and the like. We found out that he was on probation at IFD. There was a lot that we needed to investigate about the dad. And when you're talking about a younger person, it's much harder to find out about their past because juvenile records, at least at that time, were sealed. So you couldn't go to just the records as you normally might. And now we're much looser about the use of juvenile records. And so it was a matter of tracking down where he was a firefighter previously, getting those records, speaking to individuals there, and then finding about other jobs that he'd had up in Elkhart and relationships that he had.
All right. So it all started to kind of come out. And now, were these people that, seemed happy in life? Were they, was this one of those surprise moments that neighbors were like, wow, I never saw this coming. We used to barbecue with them. We were, we'd play pinochle or take the kids out. What was it? What was the story with how people dealt with?
Yeah, doesn't that always seem to be the case when somebody interviews the neighbors? Gee, they were such nice people.
Right.
No, in this case, everyone pretty much thought that William Wise was strange. Speaking to the folks at Mecca is what it was called. It was the Metropolitan Communications location. He was sort of a strange guy, small in stature, thin, very dark-eyed, very focused. And he didn't want children. We found that out pretty quickly. He had never wanted children. And one of the things that came out with a lot of investigation was that Michelle, the wife, had been talked into having an abortion of a prior pregnancy that she'd had with William Wise.
Oh, all right. How hard, I'm just curious, when you start kicking over stones looking into an investigation, how hard is it to get this kind of information? Or once people have a feel that, wow, there might be something bad about this, are they pretty quick to flip and cough up this kind of intel?
They're really not. It takes a lot of, so for example, the issue about the abortions. Michelle would never talk about that. Her mother would never talk about that, although they all knew about it. He never talked about it. So we spoke with the people that she worked with at the bank, who had known her for a long time, and had to ask some pretty directive questions. And then they told us about it. It's a matter of, as your investigation goes, it's fascinating. It builds, and you find little building blocks of evidence that it takes someone to look at and put together, because the arson case of this kind, and that means that the arsonist was not burned, which is the normal way you find out who started a fire. But because of that, it's totally circumstantial. So you're trying to put all of these bricks together. And one of the questions was, what's the motive? We knew it wasn't, or we thought at the time it wasn't financial. So finding out that he didn't want kids was pretty important. He tried talking her into an abortion of this infant, Matthew, and she chose not to do it. She just stood up to him. So, then in talking to those folks, they led us to some other folks to speak to. And it really, as I said, Leslie Van Buskirk was the detective and still is a detective in Indianapolis in the homicide division, was willing to put in the time and effort to put this kind of case together. And so after speaking to those folks, one of the gals mentioned that he had been in Florida. And so that's how we were able to get to the information about him working in the fire department. And then we went into, and I told her, and something that's true is most arsonists have been fascinated by fire since they were children. And so one of the things we wanted to know was whether or not William Wise had any history of fires as a young person. Again, we couldn't get his juvenile record, but Elkhart's a relatively small place,
Sure.
And we did get a hold of a fire chief who remembered William very well, in part because he had convinced another young kid to steal a fire truck. And I laugh at it, but it's not really funny. They stole and then crashed a fire truck. And there had been fires in Wise's past, in
Gotcha.
his home, in family members' homes.
We do have the book 16 Minutes up on today's program guide, folks. You can find the link for it so you can purchase it and go even more in depth into this amazing story. Diane Marger Moore, our guest today, as we continue to discuss this. Let me remind you, you can also hear this show commercial free. That's right. You can hear it commercial free with Stitcher Premium. All you have to do is sign up for Stitcher Premium. It's $5 a month. That's it. $5 a month. That gets you this show commercial free and all of our Darchives and brand new episodes of Darkness Radio, the best in paranormal talk radio, commercial free. You can't go wrong. But I understand. Dave, I don't have $5 for just your shows. I love you guys. I want to support you guys. But $5 for just your shows isn't worth it. Well, first of all, that's hurtful. Thanks a lot for saying that, guys. But I get it. I understand. It's a new world. Things are a little tight all over. But you don't just get Darkness Radio and True Crime Tuesday. You also get all the other great programming on Stitcher, commercial free. There are literally hundreds of thousands of hours on just about everything from cooking to babysitting to true crime, paranormal, entertainment, dancing, reality TV. You want it, they've got it. Hundreds of thousands of hours of commercial free for $5 a month. And if you go in and use the code word Darkness Radio, all one word, I believe you'll get a deep discount savings on getting your first year subscription. So go check that out for yourself as well. Stitcher Premium, and then you can access our show and all the other fantastic programs commercial free. For those of you that want to continue to listen with commercials, feel free to do so free and available right here. But remember, if you want to hear the full episode of True Crime Tuesday with Dumb Crimes, Stupid Criminals, you do have to be signed on for the premium. You get the entire interview, but Dumb Crimes, Stupid Criminals only appears on our premium content. So keep that in mind. All right, Diane, you've now started to uncover the past. You've tapped into what this guy was like, what his life was like, these strange fires and things that were a part of his world. It's obviously, starting to paint a pretty compelling picture. What about the mother in this case, though? What kind of background do you start to find on her?
Well, the most important thing we know is that there were only 3 living beings in the home before the fire started. We had the father, the mother, and the child. And so you're absolutely right. Who was most likely to have done this? So we tried exploring what they claimed occurred. and what first occurred. So what we know and what we found out was that the father had spoken to a colleague at work. Dad worked the afternoon to midnight shift. He had told a colleague that night, a young woman that he spoke with occasionally, that he just couldn't stand the baby crying. He said, the baby cries all the time, and all my wife does is run to the baby. And he sort of expressed that. And she tried to explain to him that, well, the baby will get over that. And he said, well, how long will it take? And she told him that it would take up to, in her case, it took about 6 months. So that was a concern. Now, the mother had taken maternity leave, of course, and Michelle was just going back to work. So Michelle had been with the baby all of this time and stayed up with the baby. And but that night, when Matthew Wise came home, they both admitted that he came home later than usual. We don't know why. And for the very first time, Matthew Wise said that he would keep the baby because he wanted his wife to get some rest. So Michelle, the house was a split foyer, which, if you know what that is, you come in and you're on a sort of landing, and downstairs is one floor and upstairs is the other. On the upstairs was the nursery to the left, along with 2 other bedrooms and a bathroom. And as you're walking up the stairs to the right is the living room, kitchen, dining room area.
Okay.
Downstairs was the master bedroom. So Michelle went to the master bedroom to lay down, and the father was going to feed the baby. Michelle had led, prior to that, like I said, a fairly normal life. She was a little bit dumpy and not very attractive. She was somebody who probably had not dated much. She worked in a bank. No one thought she was either really smart or really bad in any way. No one had anything bad to say about her. And she seemed to sort of really, she and her family both thought that her husband, and they had only gotten married after she was pregnant, that her husband was, pretty interesting. And they had bought him fire trucks and other stuff because he really loved the idea of firefighting. So that was pretty much all that we knew about Mom. And at one point, it was implied by the defense that, well, maybe Mom did it. And so the detective and I went to Mom's home in Elkhart, where she was staying with her family. And throughout the entire process, the mother of the child that was killed and her family totally supported William Wise. Nobody was looking out for baby Matthew. That's what we knew about her.
Now, when they start throwing the mom under the bus, when the defense is doing that, is it because they're both being covered by different defense attorneys? Or is it to just, put the shadow of doubt that, hey, if you think it might not be the father, maybe it's the mother, maybe it's neither of them. Is it just leaving that innocuous bubble out there so that they, it's either a hung jury or they don't feel there's enough conclusive evidence to, kind of incarcerate either one of them?
Well, that's exactly right. What happened was the only person who was charged with murder was the dad. And because of that, the defense, if they could convince even one juror that it was the mother who had killed the child, the dad would have walked free. And then you're in a situation, if one tries to later blame mom, mom's going to blame dad because double jeopardy is attached. So it's a pretty solid type of defense.
Solid, but flawed. Obviously, very flawed.
Incredibly flawed. Of course it is.
Right.
And so, in speaking with the mom, we knew that she had, or we believed that she had seen or heard things that would be helpful to the prosecution. She knew she was potentially being blamed by the defense, but she would not back down. She would not back down from supporting William.
That seems like quite a surprise as well.
Well,
I guess not. Birds of a feather flock together, unless, of course, she's, the burning bed syndrome kind of deal. Where is she an abused wife through this? Is she somebody that's, kind of Stockholm syndrome for this man and is willing to protect him? Or is she in fear that if she flips on him, A, it could end horribly for her, or B, he'll try to implicate her as well?
Well, what's very interesting, I would call her an alibi wife. And here's what we know.
Mm-hmm.
William Wise was dating a teenager. He was 34, I think. He was a good bit older than her and was dating a teenager who was still in high school. She got pregnant with twins.
Mm.
He went out with her one night, and she ended up dead along with the two fetuses.
What?
His alibi was Michelle. And it was after she was his alibi, that
Mm-hmm.
she kept a child and they got married.
Wow. Wow. How dark and twisted humanity is, huh?
Only some of humanity, but I'll tell you, absolutely true. He said he wanted to help the police with that investigation. He was interviewed. Actually, it's very interesting. That murder has never been solved. And a family member of that young woman contacted me literally this week. I need to write her back because that crime is still not solved. But as I said, Michelle was an alibi for him. And so when you say, how did she gain the leverage to hold on to this pregnancy? That may well have been a part of it. That I don't know.
Gotcha. Wow. All right. So once they've kind of broken through these barriers, they see that they have enough. You guys obviously have enough to take this case further. Even though the defense attorney had done a pretty convincing job, I guess, of whittling down prosecution to think that there was no case. Once it goes to trial, how quickly do things unravel for them?
Well, I can't quite talk about unraveling. I think that what occurs is that first we were able to find a motive because, well, actually two motives. The first thing that happened is in speaking to some of the attorneys, because early on, William Wise said that he thought he knew how the fire had started. And of course, that's always interesting. Well, how did you think it started? And he told us that he thought it started in the baby monitor that was in the room, a particular brand of baby monitor. And interestingly, the package for that baby monitor and the information was downstairs in the master bedroom. And so we had it. And so one of the questions was, could the baby monitor actually have started the fire? And that allowed us to focus the investigation on the type of baby monitor. Secondly, we found a firefighter, a female firefighter, who William Wise had dated during one of his, he actually was living with Michelle, but apparently they were not strictly together. And this firefighter said that when she dated him, he always kept firefighting gear in his trunk, which she thought was incredibly weird. Nobody does that. And she said, no firefighters do that. And she explained to us that he thought that if he came upon the scene of the fire and rescued someone, that the fire department would hire him. That was the second motive.
Huh. Okay.
So on the last day possible, Michelle and William filed a lawsuit against the manufacturer of this baby monitor, alleging that the baby monitor killed their child. And they were asking for millions of dollars.
Huh. That's, boy, so there was a lot of thought that they put into this as well. This wasn't just two evil parents looking to eradicate themselves of an unwanted child.
Well, the question still came down to which of the parents thought of it, and were they actually complicit with each other?
Right.
That was a hard one. That was really a hard one. But we knew that there was a lawsuit, and we knew what he wanted. And so it came down to some of the details that occurred in the house before firefighters got there. And, of course, to the testimony of some of the experts, some of which was very powerful.
Can you talk to us a little bit about that? What kind of testimony, goes on in these cases? What does it look like if we were flies on the wall in that jury area right now?
Well, the first thing that you would have is the firefighters came in to the room, and we had a large picture of the room. And the detective who uses sailor language rather easily, every other word has an F in it, but she described it as the Where's Waldo picture. All you see is black and ash, and then in a little tiny corner, if you look, there's a little white spot. And that actually was a piece of diaper. So the firefighters come in and show the room and describe how quickly the fire was put out and how long the fire lasted. And we had a number of people. There was a newspaper gal who had gone by the house very carefully and knew that there was no fire at 5 o'clock. So there were a number of witnesses who didn't know that they had anything, but they had a little piece that was important to add to the story. And so she didn't see any fire. She had delivered a paper to their next door neighbor and had been very close to the room. So we got the timing in and then what the room looked like. And then we brought on the fire investigator to describe everything that he ruled out. And he had actually collected every single electrical outlet in the room so that the jury could actually see it and touch it. And it's important that they get to do that because when you have a fire cause an electrical outlet, and some of you may have done that. I mean, some of your viewers may have, you can see like a black singe mark on the outlet. These outlets were all clean from that. And so we looked at other items in the room. And one thing that the investigator did not believe he'd found is the baby monitor. But he described the room, and then we brought in an electrical engineer to explain why the baby monitor could not have started the fire. And he was very show and tell in the sense of explaining why that little lump of plastic that's at the end that you actually plug into an outlet is called a step-down transformer. And what it does is it takes all of the electric power that we need for other types of appliances and things, and it steps it down to the same level as a little rectangular 9-volt battery. And so only the amount of a 9-volt battery of electricity was going into the baby monitor. And he actually took a lamp and plugged it in and showed the type of electricity went through it. And then he showed the jury the amount of electricity that went through the step-down transformer. In fact, he put the two little edges, the copper edges on his tongue. The jury got down and felt it and could feel that it just wasn't enough electric to start a fire. So then you have the medical examiner, of course, testified. And then it's really a matter of cross-examining the defense experts, because the defense had some experts that they brought in from all over the country to testify on behalf of the defendant.
So with that, bringing in those experts, how long does the trial actually go?
Well, unfortunately, there were two trials. One lasted 2 weeks, and the other one lasted 2 weeks.
That's not a lot of time.
No, it's, and particularly in state court where the judge really gives you a full day of testimony. Some witnesses were quite short. For example, the newspaper gal and some of the neighbors were pretty short. But yeah, it goes pretty quickly. They're pretty fascinating. I think that the jury was very fascinated.
Because you would hope with deliberations, you would hope for those deliberations to be a little bit longer, meaning that the jury is contemplating your point a little bit longer, and that you actually have some sort of a case. It seems pretty open and shut from there, don't you think?
You know, as a prosecutor, and I was only a prosecutor for 2 years and then came back as a special prosecutor on this case. I had a guilty verdict in 13 minutes, and I've had a guilty verdict that took 3 days. So I think it depends on the case. It depends on the jurors themselves, how persuaded they are by the evidence. They can be long or it can be short. And I've really given up guessing. I was with you. I thought that the jury would be out quite a while on this case. In fact, the detective and I and another prosecutor who was assisting tried to go out to lunch. And as soon as we ordered, we were called back to the court because the jury had reached a verdict.
Okay.
Now, getting that verdict and hearing it, was it a surprise? Or, you know, especially with it coming back, those quick ones can usually mean that they've got enough to find guilty, or sometimes they weren't persuaded enough, right? So was there some concern about that?
Absolutely.
So,
you know, I think there's always concern, at least the type of cases. So all I ever prosecuted were arsons and arson murder cases, with one exception of a murder case that didn't have any of that in it. But because all of them were circumstantial, yes, I think that I expected it to take longer, but you never know. And I try to never be overconfident. What I thought at the end of the trial is that we had done justice for this child, that we had done every single thing we could, and I was going to have to live with it one way or the other.
All right. Well, you get the quick verdict. The verdict, obviously guilty. Talk us through those moments and what it was like in the courthouse. And the father was found guilty, I think you said, but not the mother?
We never charged the mother.
Why not? Why not take it to the next level then?
That's a very interesting question. And in the years that I've been involved in criminal law, I always wonder, particularly, and again, as I said, I've been a lawyer for 40 some odd years, is that do women get more of a break than men do in criminal charges? I think the answer is absolutely. But in this case, I think that the detective and I were convinced that she just wasn't smart enough to have come up with this.
But she was complicit, and she stood up for him, and wasn't it perjure by lying to the courts and trying to protect him?
Well, she did. The interesting thing is, I don't think she lied unless she was actively involved. But she didn't put two and two together. For example, at one point, so when the fire started, their alarm went off. The alarm is loud. You know that it's going to wake up that child. The first thing you do is run and get the kid and then go out of the house. They didn't do that at all. They both stayed on the landing trying to turn off the alarm. So she went downstairs to try and turn off the alarm. He's standing there on the landing. When she comes back from the bedroom, she can't get it turned off. He's still standing there. He says, I'm going to go upstairs and get the phone. Instead of going up the 6 steps and turning left to get the baby, he turns right to get his phone, comes back to the landing, sends her outside. And she then stays at the neighbor's house throughout what by that time was probably
who doesn't go get the baby? Who doesn't?
Right. Who doesn't? I agree. Who doesn't? Her position was, I knew that Bill, she called him Bill. I couldn't make myself call him anything like that. But she said, I knew Bill had fire training and he told me he'd get the baby. So I still have questions about that. I particularly have questions because as I was writing the book, and prosecutors don't normally get to see what happens with the family after murder prosecution. But I went to Elkhart and the cemetery where this child is born. And in the cemetery, there's a children's section. And in the section, all these little tiny headstones, or they're actually a stone in the ground. And all of them were clean and had flowers or teddy bears. And when I finally found baby Matthews, here's this like headstone that it was clear it had dirt on it. I had to dust it off. It had nothing. It had nothing.
Absolutely heartbreaking. So mom hasn't even visited or hasn't
apparently she's remarried. Yeah. Nothing, none of the family. I don't know how that happens, but that's the way it is. So he's still in prison. Mom is remarried. What I can say is in Indiana, the sentencing didn't take place right away. It was a couple weeks later before we had the sentencing. And that was the first time that we could let the judge know about his training and the fire truck incident and some other house fires that had occurred at his house. And she gave him an aggravated sentence, saying he was the worst of the worst.
What was his eventual sentence?
Okay, you've caught me. I don't recall. And here's the reason. Murder at that time, I believe that the judge sentenced him to 60 years for murder, but he was also convicted of arson causing bodily harm, which was an A felony. His case, of course, was appealed. The Court of Appeal changed the sentence, but he is not scheduled to be released from prison. At least he wasn't until June 6th of 2037.
Oof. All right. And she's off on her own. Have you kept up on her and her life at all to look into? Have there been any other tragic deaths surrounding her life?
Yeah, that I don't know. I don't know.
It's interesting. I wonder how many people are wondering if true justice was meted out in this. You know, obviously the father was put away, but did the mother get away with murder? Did the mother get away with things that, you know, she shouldn't have? What do you feel?
I'm still very conflicted about it. Honestly, I think that as a mother, no matter how much I respected my husband, no matter what, there is no way that I would have heard that fire alarm go off and my first instinct would be to go and get that child.
Right.
And so I've got to believe that that is the maternal instinct it's not taught. It's not, I think that is a human instinct. And, you know, this woman carried this child for 9 months, 8.5 months, and had him in her arms for 2 months. She was breastfeeding him. I mean, I don't know how she could have left that house without that child, ever.
Right. And there's no statute of limitations, right? I mean, is there ever a thought of going back and prosecuting?
You know, that would be a good question for Detective Van Buskirk, I think. As I said, I had left the prosecutor's office by the time that the case actually came to trial, and I came back as a special prosecutor to prosecute this case because I felt so strongly that it needed prosecuting and that putting together a case like this was really important. Also, several of our witnesses volunteered their time. The electrical engineer that I told you about, Jim Finneran, the prosecutor's office didn't have the funds to pay him, and he did the whole case as a favor, essentially. But yeah, I think that's a good question. I don't know the answer to it, honestly.
You know, sometimes you think, well, maybe it's time to leave things be. She lost a husband, a child, a house, all within weeks. Is that enough punishment? But what is enough punishment? And it's hard to judge because in a stressful situation like a fire, in a panic mode, we all like to think what we would do. We would run, we would grab our children, we would do this and that. But if we had somebody there who was adept at dealing with this and said, don't worry, get out, be safe, I'll take care of the baby, would you go with that? Would you trust your spouse enough to go with that? There are a lot of underlying thoughts involved in this case that don't make it an easy one to consider in any way, shape, or form. I give you guys a lot of credit for sticking to it, pushing through, and making sure that somebody paid for this crime. So thank you for being involved in that.
Oh, it was a privilege for me. I think that when lawyers work for governmental entities, most of the time they're doing it because of dedication and wanting to do it, because the pay sure doesn't invite people to stay.
Right. Well, the book is out and available. We have a link for it in today's program guide, folks. 16 minutes. Was the death of baby Matthew an accident or murder? Read it for yourself. What do you think? Should there be another investigation involved? That's it for today's interview portion. Diane, thank you so much for being here with us again today and sharing your insights.
Thank you for having me. I really do appreciate it.
It's a tough story to hear, folks, as it always is when it involves the death of a child. Think about these things. Maybe it's a good idea to make a plan in action if a fire occurs. How are you going to handle it as a family, as a couple? Make sure that you talk these things through so that in these instances, in these moments, there's never any doubt that the baby will get out. So make sure that you talk to your family over this and take those things into consideration. We hope you enjoyed today's program of True Crime Tuesday. And remember, if you'd like the full episode with the Dumb Crime Stupid Criminals aspect, all you have to do is go over and subscribe now for Stitcher Premium. Use code word Darkness Radio, all one word, to get some deep discount savings for your 1-year subscription. And it will give you access to all of our archives from Darkness Radio. There's over 1,000 episodes up and available, and more being added constantly. You get all of the episodes of True Crime Tuesday, and you get all of the other great programs that are part of Stitcher. Hundreds of thousands of hours of programming for $5 a month, commercial free. You can't beat that, so don't even try. Go subscribe now, and remember to use keyword Darkness Radio for those key savings.